Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start off to share a quick 1-minute video that shares a best practice we recommend. You'll hear more about it during our presentation, but this is a complimentary service we offer to all FirstService Residential clients.
The best time to prepare for an emergency isn't after it happens. It's before the damage occurs, before operations are disrupted, and before critical decisions need to be made. That's why every FirstService Residential managed community receives a complimentary emergency response plan and property walkthrough from First On-Site. Together, we walk your property. We identify critical systems, document key building information, understand site access, and evaluate the unique risks that could impact your community. Because when we've already walked your property, we're not learning your building during an emergency. We already know it. We know your systems, your structure, your access points, and your vulnerabilities. So when a water loss, severe weather event, fire, or other emergency impacts your community, we're not starting from scratch. We're already prepared. The time invested before an event helps accelerate response, reduce disruption, support recovery efforts, and provide greater confidence when every decision matters. It's one of the many advantages of being a FirstService Residential community because resilience doesn't start after the event. It starts long before it.
That was great. Again, thanks for taking the time to join us today. Today's session is really about one thing: helping our communities be better prepared before a storm and making the right decisions in those critical first few days after one. We've pulled together a group of experts who deal with this every day, so you'll hear what actually works, not just theory. Together, this is an end-to-end view from FirstService Residential, our insurance team, mitigation, and roofing, all working together so communities are covered from start to finish. Today, we have with us for insurance, Andrew Lester, President of FirstService Insurance Brokers. For mitigation, Renee Vargas, Vice President of First On-Site. And for roofing, Jed Sabrowski, Senior Vice President, National Accounts at Roofing Corp of America, RCA. I'm really excited about this panel. In my opinion, these are some of the best operators in the industry. They've been through major storm events many times and helped communities get through them from pre-loss to post-loss. Our goal today is simple. We're going to keep it practical, keep it real, and give you a few things you can take back to act on right away. We are really proud FirstService Residential has a division called Resilience First, which is really about helping our communities prepare ahead of time, respond the right way when storm hits, and recover faster on the back end. As a reminder, we'll save time at the end for questions, so please feel free anytime to drop those in the chat as we go. But we've got an extensive agenda to cover today, so we're going to dive right in. Ben, your square is still there, which is okay, but just letting you know that. So I'm going to start as your moderator today with our panelists. And our first question is going to be over to Andrew Lester, Insurance. And the question is, what are boards most anxious about right now related to premiums, deductibles, coverage gaps, claim outcomes? Share a little bit of insight.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. And if you're on the West Coast, good morning. Really glad everyone's here. The obvious concern for most boards that they always talk to me about is premiums. I always hear this question constantly. So why did my premium go up in a year with no storms and then they come down after two bad ones? The answer has nothing to do with what happened at your specific building, of course. It's reinsurance. And I want you to think about it this way. Your insurer does not hold all the risk itself. It goes out and buys its own insurance in the global marketplace. And that market reprices premiums based on what it thinks total exposure is for your community. And it's across thousands of communities that they are doing this underwriting and repricing. So, if you think about when a storm hits an area that has not seen a hurricane for decades, if not even a century, the entire marketplace gets re-underwritten, it gets adjusted, and it's not just the communities that are hit, it's the entire, ecosystem. Where we are today, things are improving. So capital is a little bit more fluid, and we're in what's called a soft market. And so most of you should be seeing, a reduction in premiums in your renewal. But the one thing that I do want to point out is what we're getting a lot of questions recently is that in March, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have issued a new lender letter. So Freddie and Fannie are the two entities that back the majority of home mortgages in this country. And so when they change the standards for condo buildings, lenders follow. And if a building falls out of compliance, buyers in that building lose access to conventional mortgages. And so that affects every owner's ability to sell or refinance. And this matters to all of our boards. They get a lot of questions and they get a lot of pressure and friction about what they're doing to stay in compliance with Fannie Mae. So I'm going to point out three specific changes that have changed that you should be talking about. One is Fannie Mae now allows what's called actual cash value on roofs, ACV for short. Previously, associations would have to pay to replace the entire roof with new materials at today's prices. ACV is different. It pays the depreciated value and accounting for the age and the wear of the roof, not what it costs to put a new one on. So for communities that generally could not find replacement coverage in the past, this is a relief. But here's the reality. The roof does not care how your policy calculates the payout. A new roof costs what it costs. And so if the insurance pays less because of the depreciation, that gap has to come from somewhere. And that somewhere is your reserves or a special assessment after the storm. And this leads directly to the second change. The same letter, Fannie Mae raised the minimum reserve funding requirement from 10 to 15% of a building's annual budget. So there's no coincidence. They loosened the insurance standard, but tightened the savings requirement at the same time because the risk has to land somewhere. So if as a board you're choosing ACV coverage and you don't have adequate reserves to cover the gap, that shortfall will be pushed onto your unit owners. And third, starting July 1st, there is a new cap, and they made some changes here on the per unit deductible under the master policy. So the new limit is 50,000. They kind of simplified it. So that means that if your master policy has a per unit deductible structure that exceeds 50,000, your building loses eligibility for conventional mortgage financing. So buyers cannot get the standard Fannie or Freddie Mac loan, which pushes them in the private market. So that's a real estate problem, right? Not just an insurance problem, and it affects every owner in the building, whether they're buying, selling, or refinancing.
Sounds
I'll
good.
pause. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Andrew. And keeping it practical, give us maybe a few top policy items that if I was a board or manager to review, before a storm were to hit my building.
Well, I'm going to answer that a little bit differently, Eric, because right now the policy is the policy. You really can't you can't do a lot with it. I would rather focus our boards today on communication. And how often are you communicating with your residents? I would not make any recommendation to only communicate a couple of times, like if something goes wrong or right before the storm. That doesn't work. I would tell you, by the time the named storm or any storm is approaching, residents, boards, management teams, they're stressed, they're distracted, and absorbing anything new and waiting for something to go wrong is obviously very late. So as a board, your job is to make sure residents understand their exposure before any of that happens. And I would tell you it starts at your renewal, whenever that is. So when the master policy is bound every single year, give a plain language summary to every single unit owner, right? What is the building cover for? What changed this year? What are their personal deductible exposure? What does it look like in real dollars? So that's the moment to encourage owners to actually sit down with their own agent and review their personal condo policy, not just the renewal bill, right? And say, this is it's paid, it's fine, right? They need to engage with their agent to actually understand the coverage differences between the master policy and their HO6 policy. So then just continuing on the communication, right? Keep it going. Think of it less like a single notice and just a steady drip. Every couple of weeks, one topic at a time, and who to call, what to do after a storm, how to get prepared. So when the storm starts forming, then they know what to do and they're prepared.
That sounds like sound advice. Anything you can add about percentage hurricane deductibles in real dollars? We hear people talk about 2%, 3%, 5%. Sometimes boards may think that's a percentage of the damage. What can you share on that?
Great. Great question, right? And that's something that we can talk about at the renewal time. And that also ties back to that Fannie and Freddie Mac lender letter, that 50,000 per unit deductible. So that's important. I will start by saying, percentage deductibles should not be new now. Everyone's been dealing with this for many years, right? But it's really about calculating that math because those numbers, as you talk about, are getting bigger. So let's give a simple example. A 5% deductible on a building that's insured for $20 million means the association will absorb the first $1 million of damage before the insurance company pays anything. In a 100-unit building, that works out to $10,000 per unit. And that's going to have to get funded from somewhere. Okay. But let me point out another critical component that maybe boards might not be aware of. So this is where this problem gets compounded. Construction costs have gone up significantly in the past few years. And if your building really should be insured for, let's say, 28 million, and your policy is showing 20 million, it's not just the deductible that's going to be calculated on the lower number, but when you file your claim with the insurance company, they're going to factor in and say your building has been uninsured. You have not been paying the proper premium for that coverage. And so you're actually going to get less money on your claim. So
There,
the fix, a current replacement cost appraisal, and that's really important. And for all of our boards joining us from Florida, you've been getting that every year. It's required every 3 years. But in other states, it's got to be a best practice. And that's really important. A lot of boards do not get that appraisal because that means that their premiums are going to be going up to match their current valuation. But it's not a surprise you want to hit when you actually have a claim.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. We're going to stay on the insurance topic. I'll flip it over to RCA. Anything you want to share regarding loss assessment, HO6 gap? What should boards or managers do now to reduce any surprise or conflict?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And this goes along the same lines as what Andrew is talking about. Really, the key points that Andrew mentioned are communication and preparation now. And one of the big gaps that we find that causes quite a bit of conflict typically is the community manager or the board will preach to get an HO6 policy with a loss assessment rider. You guys have all been through that hundreds of times till you're blue in the face. We've all heard that, and the homeowners have heard that. But where I see the gap is as the deductibles are increasing on these communities, to use Andrew's example, if there's $1 million deductible, each homeowner would be assessed $10,000 in that scenario. And so what happens is when they reach out to their agent and they say, "Hey, I need loss assessment," they are not dictating, "I need at least a $10,000 policy limit." And that's where we find the gap. Even homeowners that believe they have the insurance, the proper loss assessment, at that point, they might not have enough coverage. So that would help tremendously. And that happens in board meetings, or the community manager is going to get an 11 o'clock, 11 p.m. email with an angry homeowner saying, "Hey, I did what you said, but I don't have the coverage." And it's that person or board member or community member that raises their hand in a community meeting, right? And we're trying to avoid that by making sure everybody understands and has that proper coverage.
Sounds good. Hearing all this, I mean, insurance is could be complex. Over to you, Renee. Let's say my hallways are flooded in a high-rise condo. I'm navigating, I'm thinking about filing insurance claim, and we need some help from a vendor to dry out. How does it work will your firm be able to start the dry out before insurance is filed or ready to be paid, or give us some insight?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. 100% yes. I mean, waiting is going to definitely make the damage worse. And of course, the first responsibility is life safety, but second is to immediately start protecting the property from additional damages. And when we talk about dry out means extracting the sitting, water, setting drying equipment, removing damaged materials, and documenting conditions. The insurance claim and payment process can take a while, but of course, mitigation, that responsibility can't wait. And just making sure that it's properly authorized and the work is properly documented and that it's been communicated to the carrier. The key is also, Eric, and we've seen this in the past, is that the emergency mitigation phase means stabilization. That dry out is stabilization. Reconstruction is not an emergent need immediately. So it's more important to separate those into two phases, the dry out first and then the reconstruction second. But to answer your question, yes, first on site would respond immediately, begin the dry out process, and continue to communicate with management, the board, and the insurance carrier along the way.
That's perfect. Now let's shift from insurance to what happens when a storm hits, because the first 48 to 72 hours often determine the recovery timeline overall. So I'll keep it with you, Renee. Hurricane makes landfall. Walk us through the first days. What's happening on the ground, sequence of decisions.
Right. Yeah. So number one is you need to maintain control, right? Got to move from chaos to control. The first priority is, of course, life safety. Make sure that the property has safe access, that the residents are safe, that the hazards such as electrical, flooding hazards, structural hazards, elevators, access, blocked access, that all those things are top priority. And then the second would be an initial assessment, right? Is there any active water intrusion? Is there roof damage? Is my building envelope penetrated? Do I have broken windows? Are there mechanical issues? Really documenting immediate documentation with photographs and videos and time stamping and really having a written log of all the damages on property. And then the next is really to focus on stabilization. So those first 48 to 72 hours after you've documented and you've assessed, you begin the stabilization, which is this dry out process that we discussed earlier. It could be boarding the building and securing the property and the building envelope, extracting the water, tarping, securing the building overall and the critical systems. And by the 72nd hour, 48 to 72 hours, the claim should be already put in, the vendors already coordinated, your residents have had communication, boards have approval from boards, there's a clear decision log, and the goal is not perfection in the first few days, but really safety and stabilization and making sure that everything is being documented and communicated.
Sounds good. Is there anything that, comes to mind you might want to add that slows recovery the most, or something that boards can control versus they cannot control?
Yeah. So definitely cannot control the path of the storm. You can't control what power looks like after the storm or road closures, but definitely a plan around clear authority. What does authority look like on property? Spending authority, definitely pre-event vendor agreements, master service agreements. And we're talking about all kinds of vendors, right? From your restoration contractor to your electrical contractor, roofing contractors, elevator, plumbing, pool, landscaping, all the contractors in advance and having communication. And lastly, like the communities that recover best are not always the one with the least damage, right? It's not the one with the least recovers fastest. It's really the ones that make the decisions before the storm, before the crisis, are the ones that would recover most quickly.
That's perfect. So I'm hearing proactive is key, which is why we're hosting this today. RCA, why does early activation and early documentation matter from your standpoint? And what gets lost if our teams wait?
Yeah, so Renee talked about putting a plan in place, which is spot on, and we 100% agree with. In the absence of data and communication, homeowners and board members are left to their own perceptions. And so that's one of the key bits of information, message I would want to get across is communicate with the board, make sure they know that you've got it under control. You've got a contractor such as Roofing Corp of America or First Onsite that can help and join into this process, that there is a plan, there is a process. Early activation starts with understanding and noticing that there's damage, right? And it's an inspection. And one of the issues that I've seen with well-intended board members or community owners is they may send a handyman to the property, for example. And first thing they do is they start cleaning up debris, right? The homeowners have an objective, right? They want to clean the property. But we need to preserve the evidence and the information if there's going to be an insurance claim. And so we follow a 10-step process, and that's advertised with the community manager, that's put together with the board's approval to make sure that there's a process in place. When there isn't a process in place, you get the random roofer that comes in, right? You get a 6-month email chain that starts to develop among homeowners when they don't understand that there's a plan. You get the Facebook group, right, that the homeowners initiate and try to oust the board, right? We've all been there in this process. And as Renee mentioned, it's very easy to prevent when you follow the right process, have the right guidelines in place. And one more thing I'll add to that is the insurance company typically will follow what's in the policy. A lot of people have the perception that they're there to deny claims, and that does happen on occasion, but they are really enforcers of the policy and they follow a plan. So it's important that we follow a plan as far as documentation early on in the process.
Perfect. Renee, you touched on this a bit earlier, but just to follow up, what does a good activation checklist look like for managers, especially in the first 48 hours?
Yeah, I think, Eric, simple is best. I think a good activation checklist is something simple that anybody can really understand and is communicated across the property. Number one is life safety. Two is going to be notification. Third, documentation. Fourth, stabilization. And then fifth, communication. And I'll just touch on those really quickly. Life safety, of course, I discussed it earlier, right? An assessment of the property, electrical, flood, fire, elevator, structural hazards. Notification is not only inside the building, but it's also outside the building, right? My boards, my management team, my insurance carrier, my restoration vendors, my roofers, all of my vendors that I had pre-storm agreements and communications with. Documentation, right? Photos, videos, dates and times, and making sure that every emails are captured and communication, everything is captured before work begins. And stabilization, which we discussed, protect the property. And then lastly, communication. Tell the residents, tell your vendors, tell your management team and your board what is known, what is not known, what areas to avoid, and having a funnel for reporting damage back to the management office and the property would be ideal.
Perfect. I'll go over to you, Jed. Maybe a big handoff gap that you've seen between mitigation, inspection, claims. How can boards prevent those gaps?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the big ways to do that is coordination, right? Where you would identify the contractors in play and you would have a coordinated effort. And that coordination takes place with the community manager, right? And this is part of having the plan in place. I've seen situations where the mitigation company comes in and starts mitigating the interior, but the roofing contractor has not gotten out there and fixed the roof or repaired the roof and made it leak free. So mitigation company comes out again. You can imagine the insurance company frowns on that. They don't like to receive a bill twice for the same unit. So I would say that's one of the biggest ways of prevention of problems is a coordinated effort. As far as the insurance claim side goes, we always recommend having a contractor with the adjuster going through the interiors, going through the exterior, going over the roof and the HVAC system. It's very important that you've got representation for the board and for the community, that can walk and understand what the insurance company is looking for. So again, it comes down to communication and planning. And I would say just pre-qualifying a company in advance, right? And I believe Andrew mentioned this early on, is you don't want to look at the insurance policy right after a storm hits. You want to know that policy in advance. You want to know what your limitations are. So there's some pre-work that needs to take place. And I would say building those relationships with your contractors early on. Those contractors are going to be busy performing work for those who put them as a priority after a storm hits. And so you don't want to be going through the phone book or Google and looking for a contractor at that point. You want to have that all aligned well in advance.
Sounds good. And back to your point, you mentioned there's leaks coming in from the roofs. You're drying out the interior because we don't want mold to come into play. Happens to be, of course, that hurricane season is during our rainy season, right? Especially in Florida. So hurricane hits you August 1st and you have rainy season for quite a bit more. We have you covered to put tarps on the roofs and do what's needed to keep you sealed in and make sure you're dried out, while we're dealing with the claim and everything else. So that's a good point. On that note, why don't maybe each of you, I'll start with first on site, give an example of how your company has helped a FirstService client, through some sort of loss.
Yeah, absolutely. In during Hurricane Helene, which was September 2024, which turns out to be the deadliest hurricane since Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Helene hit the bend of Florida, and we had a significant amount of opportunities throughout the Southeast US, but specifically in St. Petersburg, there was a high-rise condominium, a FirstService residential condominium that suffered surge, and the damage impacted the entire first floor. And what we did there, we performed, of course, that stabilization component that we discussed earlier, the drying and the structural drying of the property. We worked with the adjuster and developed a scope that was assigned by the carrier. This particular property suffered quite a bit of corrosion from salt water. And so there was electrical components, mechanical components, plumbing, and just building systems, including windows that did not fare well with the salt water. And we work closely with the board and the property management, and just happy to report here that we returned that property back to pre-loss condition, and the adjuster was very fair and supportive, and we everybody was paid and closed out. So it was a very successful project in St. Petersburg.
That's amazing. Adjusters aren't always fair and supportive, but that's great to hear.
Mhm.
Jed, same over to you for RCA, an example that comes to mind.
Yeah, so we're right in the mix of it in Kansas City right now with FirstService Residential. They had a large hailstorm on March 10th of this year. And what I really thought was amazing is the FirstService Residential team, the local team and leadership team came together very quickly. We went through our 10-step process of identification all the way to reconstruction at the end of the process. And they've abided by that process. They've worked with us on it. They've supported it. And that has made for a really nice outcome on these insurance claims. We had a bump in the road, right? And again, this goes back to what Andrew was talking about, is doing your pre-work. One of the board members told the community the deductible was 600,000. They filed a claim. The deductible turned out to be $2 million. The board member read it incorrectly. And what I love about that situation is how FirstService Residential came to the table, met with the board, pulled us in. We explained the HO6 process and how that really isn't going to make that much of a difference in the long run, and helped alleviate the stress of the board member. So again, following the process has made it really smooth, and hats off to FirstService Residential for being supportive of that.
I love it. Myself, having been in association management for 20 years now, I am well aware of having appropriate vendors being the key. So let's talk about vendors for a moment. Preventing storm chasers from taking advantage is one of the best ways to ensure your community is well taken care of in the long run. I'll start with Andrew. Why do communities that already have signed vendor agreements recover faster after a storm from your perspective?
Yeah, we've touched on this several times, right? I think we can certainly know, and many of these communities have been through storms before, right? After the storm, it's a melee. There are, as you said, chasers. What a great term, right? Afterwards, right? So planning is the key. Having agreements in place for both the delivery of materials, manpower, right? Knowing where to stage. I think that is just so critical in the component. And one thing I'll just reinforce. It is not only right what happens before the storm, but all throughout the year about documenting everything, pictures, maintenance records, all of that takes friction out of the claim in the future. So it's all about pre-planning, and just having an agreement with a solid vendor is critical.
Perfect. Renee, what should a pre-event service agreement with a restoration or mitigation vendor include to protect our clients?
Yeah, so number one, it should remove the friction before the storm. When you're in the middle of an event, there's a lot of moving parts. So you have to define, number one, is what services can the vendor provide? From a restoration standpoint, will it include drying and temporary protection and board up? From other vendors, just really getting detailed around what services they can define or what services they can provide, I'm sorry. It also should include some type of priority response language. We need to be realistic that not every vendor can guarantee response. There is not unlimited resources. And here's just a time where we can just kind of pause and think about who our vendors are for post-storm events. Are these the vendors that we've been using 24/7, 365? So when we look for some type of priority response, it's important to partner with those same vendors that you're using 24/7, 365. Pricing should be addressed. Is it going to be a time and material type of rate? Will it be unit rates? Is there going to be material markups, mobilization fees? All of that should be defined in advance. And also access. How will access be granted? Insurance coordination expectations. And ultimately, the goal is to make sure the community is already moving. While others are really still looking around for support and going on the phone book, like Judd mentioned, this is the time to take care of it in advance.
Perfect. Just to close out that segment on storm chasers, Jed, any other risks that you've seen of a client going with an unlicensed or unknown contractor after a storm, and how that might affect the claim or the restoration?
Yeah, there's several risks with that. One of them is if that contractor is caught and you're in the middle of the claim process, you've taken the standpoint of we're trying to have a process and control the claim, right? And then the adjuster finds out you had an unlicensed contractor, the adjuster is going to take over. They're going to take over that process. They're going to set the scope, and it's kind of cut you down at the knees. And so and that's the other thing we've talked about is prevention. It's easy to identify this if the contractor is unlicensed. In Florida, the Department of Business and Professional Regulation, go on their website. It doesn't even take 2 minutes. It takes 1 minute to go on there, type in the contractor's information, and you can see if they're licensed. The other issue and situation is I've never heard of a roofer walking into your office, raising their hand and saying, "Hey, by the way, we're a good roofer, but we're not licensed." Everybody is going to say they're licensed. Everyone says they follow OSHA guidelines. Everyone says we don't hire illegals, right? That's what everybody says, but there's checks and balances, and there's a way to look into that. And look, the sketchier the contractor on the license side, they're going to leave out scope items. They're going to find shortcuts. They're going to find ways to give you a lesser product. So again, sounds like a broken record, but planning, right? Measure twice, cut once, and then you've got your contractor in gear. And Eric, the last thing I'll say on this is a lot of contractors will attempt to team up with a company that is licensed, going along with the storm chaser theme. Contractors from Texas and other areas will come in, they will identify a roofing company and try to piggyback on their license. Sometimes they'll do that for a fee. That's an illegal practice. And so, again, looking it up online is the best way to prevent that.
Okay, perfect. We're coming towards closing and, of course, getting to questions and answers from our spectators. Let's talk a little bit about what boards can do right now, again, to be ready as it relates to preseason checklists, communications, vendor readiness, really anything that we haven't covered. I know we've touched on it quite a bit. So, Renee, just, again, thinking of that preseason checklist, anything else that comes to mind on what every board should complete now that we just started a hurricane season and or before the next hurricane season begins?
Yeah, so once June 1st hits, we start receiving calls about readiness and preparedness. And I think a focus on authority, we mentioned it before, authority, insurance, vendor communication, and property documentation. I know we've talked a little bit about post-damage documentation, but I think it's also very important to have the documentation conducted now. Take photos and videos of the properties now, your elevator room or your elevator areas, your electrical rooms, lobbies, clubhouses, just all of the areas to document pre-impact condition. Of course, we mentioned about the preparation with the vendors and having agreements in place today, now. There's sometimes the idea of preparing for equipment and generators and labor and consumables and supplies, and you'll never really know the impact. Those are the uncontrollables. So sticking really to the controllables, review your insurance policy and documents and your deductibles and understand that piece. And then having extra communication with your vendors and ultimately documenting pre-event is what I would focus on today.
Okay, perfect. Jed, anything that we haven't touched on that comes to mind regarding vendor readiness, let's say from a roofer perspective, baseline documentation, roles, responsibilities, expectations?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, right, once the storm hits, everybody is incredibly busy. So a pre-event service agreement of some sort is something that I would highly recommend. Identify your roofing contractor today, identify them now. So when the storm hits, you've got them on speed dial and you have their attention. When you're selecting a contractor, roofing is roofing, right? But working with an HOA community and then to work with an insurance company on top of that is more complicated. It takes more communication. It takes more touch points. When working with insurance companies, almost all of them use Xactimate software for estimation. So as you're identifying your roofing contractor today, who you'd want to jump in the race with you when a hurricane does hit, make sure that you're checking the boxes where it's somebody that understands the HOA space, understands insurance claims, in addition to understanding roofing. I'd also say baseline roof inspections are very important. One of the areas where we get some pushback from the adjuster, I know Renee is in this arena as well, is it old damage or was it caused by the hurricane? Was it caused by the storm? And so if we're able to go in there and document the condition of the roof today and then show before and after photos, it makes that process go much more smooth. And then the last thing I'll say on that is roles and responsibilities. It's really important to know who has that responsibility. What is the community manager going to do as far as what they're going to call out, and what is the board president's responsibility? The way we view it is the board approves and the manager activates, and they work with the contractors and they coordinate. So having all that ready to go in advance would be great for us as the contractor, and I think it would alleviate the board showing them that there is a plan in place.
Perfect. I appreciate that. I see quite a few questions in the chat. Before I go over to those questions, Renee, anything to add from your perspective on the same topic of vendor readiness, baseline documentation, roles and responsibilities that you didn't already cover?
Yeah, I would just say that vendor readiness is tied to how familiar the vendor is with your property. We mentioned earlier around a partnership with your vendor, and does the 24/7, 365 relationship secures that familiarity. and they'll know access, they'll know gate codes, they're going to learn your roof access points, they're going to understand where your electrical rooms and your water shutoffs are, they're going to understand staging requirements and the special conditions at the property. So I think vendor readiness is very tied to that partnership. And then as far as documentation, I think we touched on that, but I agree 100% around the point of take the pictures now to prevent conflict of was this storm damage or did this already exist?
Okay, perfect. We're going to dive into Q&A. As I said, there's a good bit here in the chat. And just a reminder that if we don't cover your question in today's live session, I will have someone reach out and at least answer the question to you. And we'll focus on some of the broader questions first that cover most states and most clients and managers. So Andrew, I'll give this first one over to you. How should boards communicate related to deductible, loss assessment, risk without creating a panic to their homeowners that they don't have enough coverage or something of that sort?
Yeah, thank you. I think this was an extension of when I first started talking about ongoing communication, and it starts with the deductible, right? So you have to communicate that amount to every single unit owner, and that, as I said, happens at the master policy renewal. But I think there's a fiduciary responsibility by all boards to encourage unit owners to look at their HO6 policy in a condo environment. And that's critical. It takes some time. It's complicated. I understand it, but on a policy level, it's very hard for a typical owner. And so, taking that time long before your renewal to engage with a broker, and maybe not just a single broker that you've been using for a long time, but one that has access to many carriers. So you heard Jed talk about the HO6 and the loss assessment. And your current policy might say it's only 1,000 or 5,000 because that's it. That's all that your carrier is providing. There are other alternatives. And so if you're facing a potential risk of $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 from a damage deductible, do you want to look at options and see what the difference is in premium? The other two things that, as when I'm just on that topic really quickly, is while those unit owners are looking at their policy and loss assessment, additional living expenses. We really haven't touched upon that. But when these communities are hit by a bad storm, right? You heard Renee talk about the whole first floor of a condo. I think that was more of a garden style condo, if I remember correctly, right? A lot of people are displaced for longer than 6 months. Traditionally, you might have in an HO6 policy $15,000 to cover additional living expenses. Well, that's just not enough in today's environment. So you need to be looking at that. I know, understand, right? Premium is important. We all want to save money, but sometimes the investment of a few extra dollars gives you peace of mind after a storm. Anyway, Eric, back to you.
Okay, perfect. Question here from Ben. Do we have some stats for this hurricane season? Like how many are predicted? I'll take that one. So yeah, the good news is that the latest forecast from the NOAA is calling for a slightly below normal season this year. They're projecting somewhere in the range of 8 to 14 named storms, 3 to 6 of those being hurricanes, and of those, 1 to 3 major hurricanes, which is basically a category 3 or above. But the big thing to remember, and we say this every year, it only takes one storm hitting in the wrong place to have a major impact. So preparation really doesn't change based on the forecast. Also keep in mind hurricane season runs from June 1st all the way through to November 30th. There's another one here from Ira. Thanks to all for an excellent presentation. How much of what is being talked about today, particularly the pre-event preparations, is expected responsibility of the property manager and the board? I'll take that one as well, Ira. We are taking care of that on our end for the most part. Yes, we want board participation, board requests, board questions, but we're gonna talk more in a minute in a bit more detail there in my closing, so you'll hear more about that. There's another one from Elise. in how does FirstService help clients vet and pre-qualify vendors before the hurricane season. For us, it really comes down to doing that work up front. So many communities are not making decisions under pressure. So we're already vetting vendors ahead of time, licensing, insurance, track record, capacity, and making sure they can actually perform during a major event, not just on a normal day. And then we're helping communities put those relationships in place before the storm hits. So when something happens, they already know who they're calling and what to expect. So we got you covered there. This question, I'll throw it to Renee. Any other biggest first 72-hour mistakes that could delay recovery and suggestions on how to avoid them?
Yeah, I would say waiting too long to act, waiting too long to assess, waiting too long to activate. Um, the recommendation would be to do tabletop exercises. Spend some time pre-event and drive some scenario-based decision making. The what ifs, right? From stage 1 to stage 10 scenario. And first on site provides that type of support in our loss assessment, but definitely having a plan in place before the event and knowing what the plan is going to be post event and activating quickly, but most importantly, assessing as soon as possible.
Perfect.
Can I add to that,
Yep.
Eric? Just to reinforce a couple points. Number one, right, is, and Renee said this earlier, report the claim. No matter what the damage is, report it, right? Get in the queue, the adjuster queue. And the second thing is, and we've talked about this, but I want to just double click on it, is pictures. Lots of pictures. Jed talked about prior, but even during the restoration, it's that those first 24 to 48 hours are critical, especially when we have multiple policies that might be responding. Flood and a wind policy. Those are two different coverages, and they like to fight with each other and pass the buck. So great documentation showing before and those first 24 to 48 hours before the teams are in there cleaning up gives you proof of what caused that damage.
That's perfect. Just as a reminder to everyone, we will for sure be done by the top of the hour. So, I'll get through as many more questions as we can in the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. There's a comment here from Beth about communication protocols before or during an event, how to keep residents and staff and the vendors all aligned. We did talk about communication a good bit today, and we do feel it's one of the biggest drivers of how smooth a recovery can be. So yes, the goal is to have everyone aligned, your board, your residents, your internal teams, maintenance teams, your vendors. So really you want to aim for no confusion about what's happening and what's coming next and when. So that usually means having a simple plan ahead of time. Who's communicating the updates? How often? Through what channels? So during the event, you're not reacting. You're just executing a plan that you've already reviewed ahead of time. So even, all FirstService Residential management team, has hurricane plans and protocols already in place. I know we have binders and all sorts of documentation that the board could ask their manager and look at. But even if you don't have a highly detailed plan there, I'd give you one key takeaway. Make sure there's alignment between, let's say, at least the manager and the president. I'm thinking of the Texas freeze a few years ago. Pipes were bursting, people didn't expect it. We had some presidents that might say, why didn't you call a plumber? I know my cell phone was down and we didn't have service, but people think, oh, do we need permission? Do we not need permission? Or a complaint of why'd you call that plumber? They were too expensive, and it's a dire emergency. So, my main takeaway to you is just make sure there's a clear understanding and a plan and authorization that we've talked about, especially in catastrophic hurricanes. It is very common for cell phones and communications, emails to be down. So you really want to make sure that there's a clear plan. The manager has the authorization and contact specific vendors in the key categories that are needed, or even better. Sometimes there's vendors that you already have agreement, and they'll come in, let's say once roads are clear. And while I mentioned while roads are clear, that makes me think about, do you have an agreement with maybe a company, maybe a tree removal company, right? So there's agreements you can make now with a tree removal company that you already know the cost, hurricane cleanup. We don't need to call you. If a cat runs through our neighborhood in Southeast Florida, you're already authorized to come and clear those roads at reasonable prices. Because trust me, I've seen price gouging up the wazoo, especially in tree removal, but many categories. So that's kind of the point of today's call. Jed, I'll throw this one to you. It's more about roofing. What can managers and boards expect from end to end, like restoration project from RCA? You can keep it high level. I know you've mentioned the 10 points before, but anything you want to touch on there?
Yeah, I think just going back to the previous comment that ties into this is the communication side, right? That's the biggest difference between our company, RCA, and other companies out there. When you're used to working with HOA communities, you understand that daily communication is highly important. And that comes through a daily report. That comes through us printing out on paper and taping notices to doors, right? There's going to be a lot of renters in there. There's going to be a lot of people that aren't being communicated with, even with your best efforts as community managers. So we are trying to prevent the angry phone calls. We're trying to prevent your phone from ringing and the emails by taking on that communication. And then along those lines, something else is we would love to attend board meetings or community meetings and explain the damage, explain why our processes are what they are. And that's something else that you could expect from RCA.
Perfect. I will jump to Alfredo. Can you confirm the minimum? So over to you, Andrew. Can you confirm the minimum recommended amount of personal liability coverage that unit owners should maintain under their HO6 condo insurance policy?
Uh, well, that ties into your exposure. So, I mean, personally, the minimum would be 300,000, but probably you want to, if you can get it, 500,000. And then on top of that, you're going to want to have, and this depends on your assets and your exposure, but a personal umbrella policy. And so that is the liability policy that sits on top of the HO6 policy and your auto policy, and gives you an additional 1 to 50 million. You can purchase it. Again, that's a personal decision, and one that you should be talking to your broker about, depending on your financial assets.
Okay, perfect. There's quite a few questions in here, so I'll surmise. It's about, what does all this cost? How do we put all this in place? I will cover that in my closing remarks here in a minute, so we'll come back to that. There's a question here about Roofing Corp of America. Just for clarification, they are a licensed contracted roofing company. So they can be used for anything from day to day during the normal year, repairs, preventative maintenance agreements, and of course, post-catastrophic loss. We will move to someone's asking about being in a co-op. I mean, everything we're discussing applies to all condominiums, co-ops, or any type of building, frankly, that has property damage insurance policy. So even if you're an HOA and you have a large clubhouse or any type of structure that has property damage coverage, this applies to you.
Yeah,
So
Eric. Yeah, we did focus on condo and co-op is a building. And just a note, just on the big thing in terms of an HOA and a loss assessment coverage, that is available. And very typically, you'll find that homeowner associations are going to be passing special assessments to cover the repair of not only the clubhouse, but all the landscaping. So that could add up to millions of dollars that has no wind coverage out there. And so that's where your loss assessment would come into play as well. Now, that's a harder number to try and guess at, So I always would tell you to maximize anything you can do to maximize loss assessment coverage. It's really, really cheap coverage. So buy it.
Okay, perfect. I'll go with one last one. Sabrina says someone mentioned a master service agreement to prioritize post-storm attention. Can you tell me some more about that? What exactly is the master service agreement? I think that was Renee from First On Site, so I'll have you take that one.
Yeah, so a master service agreement is a pre-event agreement that stipulates rates and conditions. So in the event that the association were to call us, we can go ahead and mobilize immediately to begin recovery efforts and mitigation efforts. In those agreements, we do provide a priority response as well to those clients that use us the 24/7, 365. And then we would tag on that master service agreement, and it gives us the green light to service your property.
That's perfect. Good to know. We will be getting more information out to all that have registered for the webinar, so just keep an eye out for that. One thing that came to my mind during some of the questions, it wasn't an actual question, but especially in the state of Florida, there's statutes about emergency powers that board of directors have after a named storm. So I'd encourage you to learn a bit more about that from your management team and or general counsel. So with that, we'll move to the closing because we're coming up on the hour. Again, I very much appreciate you guys spending the time and learning, and I'm very happy with the engagement and the amount of questions that have come in the chat. So thank you for that. I'll just wrap us with a few quick takeaways you can actually use. So if you think about the next 30 days, it really comes down to a few simple actions. Make sure you understand high level your insurance, your deductibles, get ahead on basic prevention and inspections, have a clear plan for those first 48 to 72 hours after a storm, and make sure your vendors and documentation are lined up ahead of time. That alone will put you in a much better position than most communities. The other big theme today, don't try to figure out all of this in the middle of a storm. The communities that recover the fastest already know who they're calling and what the plan is. And we'll keep it this simple. If you want help pulling any of this together, just reach out. We'll help coordinate for you. Just reach out to your community manager and they can get in touch with our Resilience First Division to get you started. There is no cost to engage us and to complete these complimentary inspections that we've talked about. Even a pre-loss review or just a second set of eyes on your current hurricane plan. We're here to support you. So with that, I thank you again so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. I thank our panelists for joining us and sharing their insights. And I wish all of you a beautiful rest of your day and week, and maybe a dry or non-existent hurricane season. But at least you are now armed and prepared and know that we have your back. Thank you so much. Have a great one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. This concludes our webinar. Have a great rest of your day.